Did you know that your Loupedeck could do this? Hi there, in this video I will show you how you can control smart home devices using your Loupedeck console. I have HomeAssistant installed and running to control all kinds of devices throughout the house, and the Zigbee LED strip back there is one of them. Following this tutorial, you too will be able to switch devices on and off and control hue and brightness and really any setting of any device directly from your Loupedeck. Here is what we're gonna look at in this tutorial. First, of course, the HomeAssistant API. Then we're gonna try to avoid window flickering. I will show you what I mean by that. And then, of course, the Loupedeck integration, even using the Loupedeck Dials. I will be creating some very simple JavaScript again, just like in the last tutorial, which I will link to in the card above and of course the video description down below if you haven't seen it yet. First, let's communicate with HomeAssistant. By the way, I've been using Habitat until recently, and it also exposes an API to control devices. I will put the Habitat scripts onto my Patreon page along with the files for this tutorial. But back to HomeAssistant. First, you will have to visit the HomeAssistant GUI of your installation, go to your profile, scroll all the way to the bottom, and create a long-lived access token. I'm going to call it tutorial. That's your secret key to execute API calls. I'm going to copy it and paste it into a new JavaScript file right away. On the same page, there's a link how to make authenticated requests, which shows us that we have to put our long-lived access token into the HTTP authorization header. Using JavaScript fetch, we can easily do that like so. The URL we have to call is HTTP, the IP address of your HomeAssistant, and port 8123. If you have DuckDNS and Let's Encrypt set up, you would of course use HTTPS, your DuckDNS domain name, and port 8123. We really don't need much documentation for the HomeAssistant API because there are two endpoints we can call to get the information about the devices and services that we can use. By making a GET request to /API/states, I get a detailed list of all devices, their entity IDs and attributes. I can find the device I wish to control and copy its entity ID. The other endpoint is a /API/services, which gives me a list of all the domains and services. It works like this. If we want to switch a light on, for example, we use the turn on service of the light domain. Let's try it. I create a JavaScript object with the entity ID set to the ID I found earlier. Then I make a post request to this URL /API/services/ the domain, which is light, and then / and the service name, which is turn_on. And of course, I stringify the object to JSON for the body of the post request. I will comment this out real quick. Save it and execute, and the lights behind me are now turning on. How can I get the current state of a device? Just gonna enable this again. Let's go to states / and then we just have to put the entity ID here. So that's that one, and then comment this out maybe. So, save, execute again, and I can see that the LED strip back there is currently on with a certain color temperature and also a hue saturation color value. And I can see all the other attributes that this particular device has. Now let's make this JavaScript a little bit more user-friendly by pulling the entity ID, the domain, and the service out of our command line arguments. And also the attribute and the new value we want to set. Something like this. So the first three arguments are for the entity ID, the domain, and the service, and we use it, the entity ID here. We also use it in here, and then we use the domain and the service down here. And then all the rest of the command line arguments we just step through, and if it matches something like key equals value, then we just set the body of the key to that value. We can do it like this, right? So, and then of course we post the request with that body back to our service domain service. Now I can remote control my LED strip back there with this command, deno run HomeAssistant.js. Then the first argument is my entity ID, which is this. Then the domain name, which is light. The service name, which is turn on. And then I can set an attribute, for example, brightness % to 100, and it is bright now back there. Remember, to know which attributes a specific device has, you can always query d/API/states/entity-ID API endpoint. And to see which fields you can set with a certain service, you can fetch d/services endpoint. Here I am filtering the long list of services by the light domain and access the fields attribute of the turn on service. For example, I could send a brightness step % value to increase or decrease the brightness instead of setting an absolute value. The script I have put together for controlling lights from my Loupedeck can be used like this and allows me to set single values, array values for colors, increase or decrease single values, and values in arrays, even with clamping. This script is available for patrons at patreon.com/chrisp. My name is Chris and I make tutorials here on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed the content so far, and if you do, I would kindly ask that you show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing. It really helps and tells the YouTube algorithm that it's a good video and other people with similar interests might also like it. Thank you. I am sure you have realized by now how powerful all of this is, and that you can integrate your smart home devices into any software project, really, not just your Loupedeck. Speaking of Loupedeck, let's get rid of those flickering windows next. Calling an HTTP API from our very simple JavaScript, executed with deno, works surprisingly well. But with every run or every Loupedeck button push, we start a new deno process, which runs in a Windows terminal window that pops up onto the screen for just a split second. When I repeatedly execute deno with the Elgato script from the last video, I get the terminal window flickering on screen. This is a bit annoying, but we can fix it. There's this free tool called NIRCommand, NIRCMD, for Windows that allows us to execute any command without showing a terminal window. The download link is in the video description. All we have to do is download NIRCommand, put it in the same folder as the deno.exe, and then call deno through NIRCommand, like this. NIRCommand exec hide, and then whatever we want to execute in this hidden mode, which is deno run allownet, and then our Home Assistant JavaScript, and then the parameters. And this gives us the perfect solution to plug everything into our Loupedeck software. In the last video, I created a batch file and then a shortcut to that batch file and put the arguments into that shortcut. It works, but there's a better way. We can just put everything into a shortcut. No batch file needed. So here I am in the directory containing the JavaScript file, deno, and NIRCommand. I need to execute NIRCommand, which calls deno, which executes the JavaScript file with some command line arguments. So the first part of that whole thing is NIRCommand, and I'm going to create a shortcut to NIRCommand. Right click NIRCommand, more options, create shortcut. I'm sorry my system is in German, but I'm sure you know what to do. Then I'm going to call this LEDs toggle, for example. And then I go into the properties of that shortcut, which just calls NIRCommand.exe. And then I put all my arguments in here. So I want to exec hide, which are options for NIRCommand, to call whatever in this hidden way. What do we need to start? Deno.exe, run, allow net. Then what script are we executing? HomeAssistant.js. And then we can add our parameters that we need to send to our JavaScript, which is, first of all, the entity ID of the LED strip, then the light domain, and then we're going to use the toggle service, which, yes, is a valid service for the light domain. Go back here. So here we have our LEDs toggle. And if I click that, the lights are turning off back there. And if I click it again, we're toggling the lights back on. Awesome. Now I can control all the shortcuts for all the commands I want to send to Home Assistant to execute services on various devices and send whatever attribute values I desire. And in the Loupedeck software, I can create buttons that call these shortcuts and even call shortcuts when turning the dials. For example, I can change the brightness of the key light with this dial, and I can change the hue of the LEDs with this dial. You can set this up by creating a dial adjustment, selecting the run type, and calling one shortcut to decrease and another one to increase when the dial is turned. By the way, in the previous video, I said that you have to add .lnk here, but you don't need that. It actually works fine without the extension. Just don't turn the dials too quickly. Allow some time for the process to run in the background. So far, we have only accessed local APIs, but you can use that same exact technique to call any API of any service. For example, I have a Loupedeck workspace to track the time I work on different customer projects by calling the toggle track API. Let me know which other interesting API integrations for Loupedeck you can think of. I think this is great. However, one downside to the solution is that we cannot change the Loupedeck display. Wouldn't it be nice to see the brightness or the hue value next to the dials? That is currently only possible using the Loupedeck SDK, and I have not had time to tinker with that yet. Maybe in the future, the local Loupedeck software instance could itself expose an API over HTTP. That would be amazing for non-C# developers like me. The other downside is obviously that each request needs to be executed in its own Deno process, which is neither efficient nor performant. But I'm actually really surprised how fast everything executes, even when turning the dials. Just turn the dials slowly and it's all good. I hope this video was educational and inspiring, and if so, please do me a solid and hit that like button. Share the video with other Loupedeck or home automation fans and subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you soon.